this angle. However, this is the wood siding that was, this isn't modern wood siding. This was built in the 1880s. And this is the fruit cellar, which they added later. And that's where, as far as she remembers, that's where the milk went. In the old days, often this fruit cellar would be built on a small stream to keep it refrigerated. That is not the case in here. Or it would be put in the streams.
If it went bad, then it was buttermilk.
That's right, yes, buttermilk. So this is Buttermilk Creek, not according to Aunt Rachel, but according to another cousin, another who is transmitting to us, Marion, another history with. She says this was Buttermilk Creek, and just to event it, and they had to take them down the hill and put them in here, especially in the hot months of July, and that water is so cold that Aunt Rachel tells stories that. You know, she couldn't believe, for example, when we told her that the foundations that we now know are a mill would be an ice house, because she said, you didn't need an ice house. That water was so cold it would freeze your feet. She remembers going in here in July, and they used to dam up. She and her brother, my father, used to dam up here and go swimming, but she said, my Lord, you didn't stay in long. And, of course, they fished for trout, but... wasn't very long. It goes back a long time that you couldn't fish as you wish in these streams. It was controlled fishing. So on the Saturday night, the milk cans either came from here or the fruit cellar, but one of the families who moved into the house when it was sold in 1943, the farm to O.D. Vaughan, as Jim said, who was the vice president of T.E. Eaton, and basically was making a summer home. This was the beginning, 1943, the beginning of the end for the original Scot-Irish Ballinafat community, as Jim described earlier. So they would get out the milk and they'd take it in on the Saturday night. Now that is when, if they had time, then I think, and you correct me, Jim, that people would congregate at the Fallbrook home, at the Mackay house, because in the later years, because Sandy played the fiddle. You know more about that story than I do.
Yeah, I'll put it in if it's appropriate.
Yes, I would ask that.
Especially in the early days of the 20th century, the 10s and the 20s and the 30s, and when my parents were getting together. I mean, my mother grew up on the farm next to Mackay's farm, the McMenemy farm, and just north of that was the Sinklers, and the McHenrys were not far away, and there was a lot of intermarrying in that connection. And that was because the Saturday night socials were held in farmhouses, and they would move around. Somebody would host it, somebody else would host it next week, and they would have dancing, and Sandy was the violinist. And somebody else would play a piano if they had one, but that's the social life. That's why the community was so close, because you could walk, and that's why partners, men and women, found their partners on the next door farm, so to speak. If you read through the history, you'll find in the Scots those families that I mentioned and a few others with a lot of intermarrying. But that was the social life. This church didn't have a basement under it at that time. There was the community hall there, which was pretty old and rickety, but I remember going to card games there and so on. But it's a new hall now and much improved, of course. But that part of the social life based on homes, I think, and based on music and dancing and Scots and fiddles and reels and whatever else would be very important to the culture of that time and to the social life and to the future of the Scots race through all the relations and couplings that were made there.
Good. One thing certain is that they didn't appreciate these Scot families, as many immigrant families being cut off from their homeland, and they basically remade their homeland here. And we feel those roots when we come back to them, when we come back, but we all left them. So, getting back to Aunt Rachel, what she remembers especially too is the birthday parties, because her birthday was August 10th, so she always had it on that farm, and that was a big occasion. And all the kids around would walk down to that. She also remembers a lot of kids in the summertime walking around in bare feet and walking long distances in bare feet. She never complains. Nobody ever complained about. She never ever complained about being poor or lacking things, and of course she never did in the basics. What she did lack was that she was pulled out of. Aunt Rachel was pulled out of school at 14. So, do I have a? As far as the life on the farm for her, for my Aunt Rachel. Okay, her now Aunt Rachel's jobs. She would not have to get up with her Aunt Kate and Aunt Ellen at 5 o'clock in the morning. Her rendezvous, her appointment was to be up for 8 and take care of her grandfather Donald, the patriarch. Because in the later years he wasn't working on the farm at all. I mean, he died in 1931. So she knew him for 10 years, and her job was to take him, get him, his first thing they did was they had to walk up to the line and get the Globe and Mail, which was brought in Toronto overnight by train and horse, I guess, or just horse. She remembers it was delivered, and it was always yesterday's. And bring back for him his Globe and Mail, and then her next job after that was, he was independent. I mean, he did his own toileting and everything. That's really a nurse's perspective. But he then she combed his long white hair and his long white beard. And in the colder days, it was inside. But in the older days, in the warmer days, in July, it would be, they'd take him out in an old rickety rocking chair, and he'd sit under this tree, which is a splendid tree. We see it in other pictures, older pictures. It was a splendid tree. And that's where he would sit out during the day. And her job was sort of to answer to his beck and call. And then she played or helped. And we see pictures. You see the pictures we saw of her holding a horse. The pictures you showed us, we see a picture of Aunt Rachel a number of times, either on a work horse, on top of a hay rack, or she was holding the team of horses, these huge work horses. She seemed to be all there by her alone, holding on and she was only about 5 or 6.
We posed, I think, that picture.
Yeah, I think so. It would be posed.
Those are very gentle horses, those.
Yes.
Big work horses.
Yeah, they are.
My mom used to have Clydesdales, and when she was about 5, she used to climb up their necks.
Oh, is that right?
When they were grazing in the field.
Yes.
Just sit on top, and they'd wander around, and she'd just sit there.
Oh, yes. This is in BC. Oh, yeah.
Way up in the mountains.
Oh, is that right? Oh, beautiful. We're mountain people, huh? Being mountains gets in your blood.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't it? So, that is basically, is there any other, for the moment, I mean, as I described, we have done a number of discussions and not specific interviews. We just talk about it when it comes to the spirit, comes to the mind, and Aunt Rachel remembers more and more stories as we go on along. Okay.
What about...
Go ahead, yeah. Here I am.
Her marriage?
She married... Mr. Swan. Swan, right? Cleve Swan. How many years ago? And then she has 3 children, 1 boy, 2 girls. The 2 girls are retired. One lives very near to her in Owen Sound, is a widow, and takes very good care of her. She has a boy. Her boy is in finance, near Toronto, and she has another daughter who's retired too, and lives near Peterborough.
Where did she meet her husband?
In Owen Sound.
In Owen Sound. So
they're old.
Area.
Pardon?
Wasn't anywhere in this area then.
Cleet Swan. When I say Cleve, Cleet Swan.
Cleet?
No, the connection was through Owen Sound, and he was German, so she married out of the clan, but that wasn't a problem. Whereas her brother, my father, married a pure Scot, even to that generation. It's just our generation which has Pardon?
Oh, I was gonna ask where he was from. If you
In
said
Germany?
he was no. You said the last guy that you mentioned was a pure Scot.
Your father married one of the Sinclair girls, didn't he?
My grandfather did. Yes.
Your grandfather.
Yeah. This is the good story too. No, my father married a pure Scot in Owen Sound,
Okay.
but from a different side of the tracks. Whereas the Ballinafad community, you didn't go across the tracks. There were no. I mean, you didn't marry between the rich and the poor. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Or higher status, because it was all the same status. Is that pretty well true? Yeah. Where the status and the money was Georgetown and Glen Williams, the very prosperous farms. And you can see that in the atlas that we show constantly. You can see the difference. Whereas this was basically a survival community, as it was. So in this picture, what is interesting is you see her grandfather David, Aunt Rachel's, his wife, who is Bessie Sinclair, and this is Patriarch Donald's other son, William, who married Jessie Sinclair, two sisters marrying two brothers, who they grew up on the farms, stone throw, they visited all the time. So Donald couldn't stay on the farm, and they left, as I said, to go out to Toronto, then to Owen Sound, where they had Aunt Rachel and two other brothers. And William, he went where did he? Anyway, that's Bill McKay. It's another one of our cousins who's involved in the Fallbrook campaign too. William, anyways, we'll get that history later.
Bill's father is Earl.
That's right. He worked in this area.
Yeah, he was a carpenter, Brampton.
Yes, yeah. Because he was my grandfather, Aunt Rachel's father, was the carpenter. So when he came back to the farm, he did a lot of the carpentry work. Now those would be techniques that he learned in Scotland, growing up in Rogard, because this stonework too that we see in the bridge. These are all techniques. They're specific to Scotland. So this is the you see once again here her father David, and this is Uncle Sandy. This is Uncle Sandy, who we see.
Hold the picture too.
Whoops. Yes, Uncle Sandy, and Bob, and John. Now these people, boy, these two didn't survive. Bob and John. They're brothers, but they didn't survive. That's not specific to Aunt Rachel at all, but there was these Crofter families, exiled families. It was a pretty rough life, and it showed. These two committed suicide, actually. One out in the West and one in Toronto. It was a hard life. So, concerning Aunt Rachel, that's about it. There'll be more coming about Aunt Rachel as we go on. We'll be having other conversations with her.
Okay.
Oh, no, there are other stories.
Oh, go for it.
You have your questions, too. Sorry,
Well,
go ahead.
no, you mentioned that they're just kind of stories as she thinks of them. So you have your stories there, just
Yeah, I do have a good story.
because I think you're basically covering a lot of the questions as you're going anyway. So
Okay, because I don't want to repeat.
that's okay.
One thing she does remember also is the way they made money on the side on that farm, because they didn't make any money, real cash. Everything was bartered. You grew vegetables, you grew your beef, you had lumber, and you bartered. They did make some money because they had a granite quarry right down, not far from here, right on the Fallbrook farm. And they did, it was the pink sandstone that was used in the Parliament buildings in Toronto, in a lot of the homes. But the one story she does remember that is interesting, just to finish with the story, is that there were 3 men who would come out at a specific time of the year to dynamite. And actually, it's not a very funny story. And what she remembers about that is they drank a lot, and they drank on weekends. Pretty dangerous job.
Those were the Logan boys.
The Logan boys, right. Exactly. Alma just told me that story this morning too. And unfortunately, they got really drunk. They lived in a small house beside not far from the Fallbrook home. And on one weekend, they got really drunk and burned the house and died with it. The three brothers. She remembers that very distinctly. So that's about it for now. What about your questions? Boy, I'm more confused than that. But I am almost retired, you know. I have an excuse. Good.
Talked about our children. None of the children are settled in this area.
No.
either.
Rachel has came back here till 1931. She was back here for the funeral and the burial of her grandfather, Uncle Donald, the patriarch, the funeral was, he died at home. The wake was at home, and a good Scot wake, and he was buried. The burial site. This is his tombstone, which is right near the church where we are now, Providence Cemetery, and it is a family plot. It was built on a farm. It's not wasn't a church plot back in those days. This is the excuse me, and I do have a far. This is right across the corner here. I do have a picture somewhere of the Providence Cemetery.
Over at the 9th line corner there.
Yes. So, I think after that she was very attached to the church. And she remembers very much, she remembers walking to this church. Is that possible? From the farm?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she would walk here. And then she enjoyed, for example, she would come and visit the Kirkwoods, and she remembers coming up here for a week or two, living upstairs over the general store that Jim's father had here. And those were she has very warm memories of Fallbrook.
Okay.
Great place for a kid to live with all those candies downstairs.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So have we, this is a start anyways.
When are you going to do your own story?
Well, I can do it another time. It's, you see, my story is much more modern. I didn't know all this. I've come all that. Being Scots for me wasn't very nice. We can cut this. We can put it down if you want.
But I think your story of going to Scotland, making the connections, getting turned on to this whole project.
Oh yes, yeah.
I think that would be a story that would link it to Scottish studies and to.
Well, it linked us directly to Graham.
We've got like
Yeah.
40 minutes
You should
before.
maybe.
Okay.
If you want to talk about it, can I plug in my
Yes.
recorder because it's starting to
I'm
run
just
low
going to go to
on
the
battery.
bathroom a minute.
So that's a bit more speculation, at least about the native village, and the reason why it was there.
Okay.
Is that your father?